Welcome back to another episode of The Stay-at-Home Mom. And I'm going to talk about some things that are very politically incorrect kind of information. And it's kind of one of those videos that will probably be used against me down the road at some point. It's one of those videos that would probably cause people to unsubscribe. I don't know, but this is kind of my opinion and my thoughts. So the question is, are removing monuments and statues erasing history? In a sense, I'm going to say technically no, because technically you can't really erase something from the past. But what is happening is we are having a revision view of the past. We are reinterpreting things in the past to fit a certain ideological viewpoint. So if I speak about my experience, now I'm going to post a link to my other video about some of my issues with public education when it comes to history, and I focus a little bit more on government, but there's some things there. So when I was in elementary school, or as far back as I can remember being little, learning about the Civil War, I simply learned that they fought over slavery. The North wanted to end slavery, and the South wanted to keep slavery, right? Pretty much was the gist of it. As I got older and watched more documentaries, learned things from my dad, who I think was often probably a better history teacher than school was. And then I had a history teacher in high school that kind of expounded more on that and really went into depths of how secession and the Civil War got started. And it really kind of made me see, oh wow, it wasn't so black and white. There was a lot of it to it. And kind of what we've seen in most of a lot of things in school, and even in literacy, even stuff that I look at for homeschooling, we do put a lot of historic people kind of on pedestals, and we make heroes out of them. Now we look at why are they made heroes, and it's because of maybe something they did in the past. I think Thomas Jefferson did some pretty cool stuff. He wrote a lot of good ideas, and he had a lot of really good principles that I agree with. So a lot of our founding fathers had these really general ideas and principles in mind, and these principles kind of made a bedrock for our country, and kind of what a lot of us Americans, we kind of have ingrained in us from the early age, even today, that the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we can definitely argue that there were exceptions to their fundamental beliefs, and holes have been poked in that, which to some extent they need to be. But it still doesn't change what those principles are. We kind of just expanded on those principles to be more inclusive, but we still hold on to those ideals. Free speech is something almost everybody wants. I think there are some people that do believe free speech has limits. The thing is, who gets to decide who has those limits? And so what I'm seeing from a lot of people, especially the woke homeschool community, which I don't think makes up a whole lot, but is we're just trying to trash everything and just totally go, you know what? These were all just terrible, awful people. Let's ignore what at the time were maybe good things and just look at our modern world view and how we see things and apply these 2020 standards to people 100, 200 years ago. Heck, even like 70 years ago, even. And we kind of make complete villains out of people. Now, I will tell you straight up, I don't really care for a lot of presidents. They don't hold something special in my eyes, but I recognize kind of the cool things that they did. And then I kind of go, wow, they did some really crappy things too. We're human beings. No one's perfect but Jesus Christ. my dad and my mom, especially, I think it was more my dad, took us on road trips all over the U.S. And it was always really neat for him. I didn't think I appreciated it much time, but, we go look at statues and monuments. And I didn't always until I got a little older, because we would sometimes repeat places we would go. And I could start to understand and appreciate what those statues represent and the history behind them. When I was younger, it was a lot of times looking at, wow, that is really big and really cool looking. Look at how someone was able to make that. That's really neat. And, I don't think a lot of us are taught kind of a lot of the historical context behind why a lot of monuments and statues were built. We have completely villainized a whole group of Confederate soldiers that supposedly wanted to keep slavery. And that the Union were just these good people that wanted to abolish slavery, when that is certainly not true. History is very complex, and the things surrounding the Civil War are very complex. The Confederate soldiers that fought had this mentality, and the Union was the same way. People had a lot of times, back then, had a lot more fierce loyalty to their state over their whole country a lot of times. So I'm not saying Robert E. Lee was a great person, because the dude owned some slaves. And I was listening to a podcast recently kind of explaining the complexities of why he kind of owned slaves, even though there's enough to say he really wasn't a fan of slavery. I think he just kind of was like, well, this is legal, contract, whatever. Hey, it was kind of just, he's kind of a product of his time. And I think a lot of us are products of our time. A lot of people back then are just products of their time. And maybe their time period kind of sucked. And that's okay to admit that. But we should also recognize that, why did they think that way? Even the Aztecs were like totally engaged in human sacrifice and rituals, and which would be very much condemned today. And, that's kind of just the way they thought. It doesn't mean that their actions are any less evil, but we kind of know maybe why they did that. Anyway, so my dad put it best one time. I don't know how long ago. He said, your average Confederate soldier that didn't own slaves and was probably just nothing but a poor farmer probably really just were told by the powerful political elites that, hey, these Yankees are coming to take your land. You better fight for it. And so they did. A lot of Confederate soldiers were even conscripted and forced to serve. They faced hangings or shootings if they didn't serve. And sometimes that was kind of like the sad move they had to make. Maybe it made them cowards to fight for something they didn't want to fight for, but they recognized, hey, maybe this is the only way I can save my family. Maybe this is the only way I cannot die. Maybe it was kind of brave. Maybe it was kind of cowardly. I don't know. I wasn't there. I think sometimes we do things in the moment that we think are okay, or it's just sometimes about survival, part of history I did learn in school. I think this is another interesting, is that how I've seen peers of mine recently with Juneteenth saying, I didn't learn about this in school. When I'm thinking, yeah, you did. You just don't remember learning it. I'm from Texas. Juneteenth is a state holiday. Most people really don't celebrate it. It definitely is something that has been more of something in the Black community, or kind of more to certain regional areas, especially since Galveston, and more people celebrate it. But I definitely learned about it is Texas history, probably 7th grade, because it was both in 4th and 7th grade history. And I definitely grew up seeing things on the news about it every year, about whatever usually Juneteenth celebration was happening in Dallas, which was the largest city from where I grew up. I knew about it. I've known about it just for years. And I had classmates of mine saying, this is proof that our conservative town growing up was just racist, and history was racist. And even my sister, that's 11 years my junior, she remembers learning the exact same thing. Probably kids just weren't paying attention, because to most, history is kind of boring. I was the kid that would sit there and probably read through my textbook. I can remember very much in my textbooks always having sections set specifically assigned for, women that did something really cool during this time period, or African Americans that did something really cool during this time period. And there was definitely, there was no revision so much like in my southern town that we had this southern pride. No, I was taught that, hey, slavery was evil. We are glad the South, overall lost the war. And look at these great heroes like Harriet Tubman and other abolitionists that did wonderful things to bring people to freedom and liberty, those same principles that our founding fathers had. And we totally ignore that the unions there were slave states in the Union that chose not to secede. There was segregation in the Union. Abraham Lincoln believed that African Americans need to go back to Africa. Okay? Products of their time, unfortunately. This is the way people thought. They believed in the differences in skin color, and unfortunately that was just kind of like a normal part of society. And I don't think people always meant evil by it necessarily. It's just kind of, we are very much creatures of our environment and the way we think and the way we are influenced. So I'm kind of making this video just kind of saying this is the importance of why I homeschool, because I recognize that history is it's beautiful and tragic. There's good and evil, and kind of recognizing that why people did the things that they did. Why did they believe what they believed? And not just taking this whole like revisionist view of history that the Confederates were all a bunch of people that just wanted slavery. I mean, yeah, I think your political elites always have an agenda and they want power and control for certain reasons. But we can't paint the Union as these like wonderful people either. I mean, the Sherman March destroyed businesses, lives, homes. It was still just as evil as the act of war is. So, as the first book I showed you, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History is by Tom Woods, and he does a wonderful podcast. He's a great historian, and he really challenges so many of the things that I thought I kind of knew growing up or what I would hear, and I would learn so much more to it, and that was really cool. There's so much history, and I love it. And I just learn new things about history all the time because school really sucks at teaching history. It just does. No one has time for it. My husband bought this book. He's a history teacher. There's some kind of interesting information in there. I think there are times he kind of misrepresents things to kind of spin it a certain way. Good information. This is very popular among the woke homeschool community, and it's kind of the same thing. He is kind of definitely, I think he's a Marxist. So he is going to view things from that world view. It doesn't mean that what he say is necessarily wrong, but as I attended a lecture by the author of this book, which that's even bigger and way more going on in this book, he kind of showed where Howard Zinn was wrong on things. That doesn't mean that everything he says is necessarily 100% right, but there are I have these books that I can compare and read things, and their sizes are sorted, so when I want to go really dig into it, I can really see what all is there. And then there's just kind of this like random book that was like a discarded library book that my husband kind of, picked up somewhere to kind of, flip through. So this is just the importance of why I want to homeschool. I want my kids to really know full depth of history. I'm really sad that they are probably not going to be able to see some of the really cool sites, because I went off the rail. Some of the really cool sites that my parents took me growing up to those statues. They may not be there anymore. I mean, right now we say we're moving them to museums, but they're totally removing a statue of Roosevelt because it's in front of the museum and because it's somehow racist, which you can delve into the history of that. I recently found out that Booker T. Washington actually helped fund a Confederate monument. And in this letter, he kind of talked about how he visited with a former Confederate general. And he said, talking with him and the stuff, he says, I think this is good for race relations. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. There's someone that's really relevant to the time period and kind of understood to know what was going on. So what I also fell in love with a few years ago was reading Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. And I realized how much he saw the importance of education. And while reading it, I was still teaching at the time. And I saw that, wow, as a whole, most kids don't value education. They don't see it as something in order to achieve in life. It's just kind of like, hey, this is something I've got to do. This sucks. Who cares? And I understand there are some things about that, and even parents don't emphasize the true value of education. And I really look forward to reading that book to my girls at some point. But the future holds as far as monuments and things in museums. Yeah, maybe they're being removed and put in museums, but what happens when the things in the museums are destroyed because they're not politically correct? What happens when the museums burn down and it's not left? I am kind of worried about history kind of being erased. I mean, who's to say libraries are removing books because they're not politically correct? Won't happen. I read a biography on Harriet Tubman a couple months ago. It was written when she was still alive. There was kind of some stuff, questionable stuff in there that would not fly today, but you take it for what it is. Anyway, tell me your thoughts. Hit the like button and subscribe.